we both agree that children are always the priority of the couple. That, I mean, if you think about it, in a good long-term relationship, we are, focus on each other being the most important person in the world to each other, and together our children being the most important people for us to focus on. And so these are very important things to find out about somebody before you actually make that decision that you're going to stay with them.
Yeah, I think, we talk about having meaningful conversations, and certainly having worked for, close to 30 plus years with couples, some of those just don't take place. Because we love somebody, we almost anticipate them to be on board with everything that I think. And it's often a real surprise for a lot of people that as the relationship develops, they discover that the other person, really deep down doesn't necessarily think the way they do at all. One of the big problems that I have with a lot of couples is they actually don't check things out with each other. Even simple things, they make assumptions about what the other person might be thinking or feeling, and then run on the assumption and not check it out. I mean, as simple as if he loved me, he would know what I need.
Oh, that sort of magical thinking about, people being able to read each other's minds, it's all part of the whole lusting process, along with the fantasy that this person actually is so wonderful and terrific and brilliant that they are everything you ever wanted. And that lasts, we all know from the research, between 6 months and 3 years, which is why giving people time and getting to know them is a really good plan, because as the lust fades, often you find there is nothing there to connect you to this person. Sometimes, if you're lucky, then you realise that they are the person that they appeared to be, and that the lust has changed into love and devotion. But it takes some time. But unfortunately, many people get caught up in the fantasy and make decisions while in the midst of the fantasy rather than in reality.
Yes, Disney has a lot to answer for in my book.
Well,
so do the fairy tales. Although some of the fairy tales are worthwhile paying attention to.
I think the fairy tales are not the problem. I think that the fantasy is the sort of stuff that you find in some of the more, and let's face it, the romantic era is several hundred years ago. It started this whole concept of falling in love and finding your soulmate, and there only being one of you in the world for each other, and all those fantasies that entrap people into misery. And it's something that we need to challenge as intelligent human beings.
Now, you raised an important issue before indirectly, and that was the sort of 6 months to 3 years. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about that, in the sense that there are very strong developmental phases in a relationship, aren't there?
Oh, yes.
And I mean, if we think about our relationship, there, we did an enormous amount of growing in that first 3 years of actually living together.
Well,
let me help you out. From my point of view...
Well, everything did change fundamentally in those 3 years, if you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I was just reflecting on the whole thing about cooperation. I needed to come to that a bit. Having been an only child, I didn't need to cooperate with anybody really, other than my mother, who sort of was pretty loose with the whole thing, because she pretty well did everything for me. So doing things like keeping the kitchen tidy, which I know you used to drive you up the wall because I wasn't that compliant with it. But that's when I discovered through that process too. And oh, yes, I was a slow learner. It took me a while, especially becoming a dad then and working, great with the kids, but not so much the laundry phase of that existence. I needed to grow into that capacity of really getting out of my head and not judging why it was that I was cooperating with you. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. It was like, when my first experience of being asked to do stuff that I didn't particularly want to do was that I felt it was like an imposition. And then the discovery came that it wasn't an imposition, it's just what you did when you lived together and actually cared for each other. It was a caring thing to do. Me growing into this idea about, cooperating with you and working together with you was one of the caring behaviours. It wasn't sort of like, I'm doing that to keep her off my back. And I think that's one of the challenges a lot of men that I sort of see need to really get through into their psyche, is that there's this often sort of, counterbalance between dominance and control and not being dominated and not controlled and free will. I know it gets a bit esoteric at that point in time, but I have conversations with men about this all the time. Why is she nagging you? Well, because she's on my case about, I haven't done X. Oh, right, so she's asked you to do something and you haven't done it? Well, I'm getting around to it. Well, when did she ask you to do this? Oh, it'd be a couple of months ago now. And I go, she's not nagging, she's reminding you fervently to get this thing that you committed to doing done. And for a lot of guys, that's like a bit of a wake-up call. So when we talk about, a long-standing relationship, I think those individual learning points like I've gone through were really, I think, fundamental to my growth as a person, as a man. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes, because, it's important to remember that we were both raised through the 50s and the 60s in very stereotypical childhoods. Although your mother worked, mine didn't. And we were then sort of influenced by changes that were happening in thinking around equality and around opportunities for people to live their lives differently from the good housekeeping fantasy vision of the 1950s. And I think, layered on that is the fact that you were an only child who was wonderfully indulged by your delightful mother. And so you came into my life not having actually ever been needing to look after yourself in a domestic perspective. And the reality is that this really tailors into my own little passion about values around the tasks of life, and the fact that everyone needs to come to understand that in living together as a couple, you are then combining all of the tasks of life and then dividing them up in a way so that everyone gets to do what they need to do and what they want to do. Now, we all need to have a clean house and clean clothes and an environment that we live in that doesn't attract the vermin and that is reasonable for, safety and health. We all need to earn money. And we all need to have our more esoteric needs met in terms of our interests and our enjoyment and passions and fun. Now, in the past, these tasks of life were divided up and valued very differently. And they were divided up on a gender line. And when we got together, that had all been challenged, and there was no interest in my life in me suddenly becoming the 1950s housewife on any level, even if we could have afforded me to suddenly give up work and do that. And there was no interest from your perspective in me turning into that person because that wasn't who I was.
Nor was it who my mother was.
No.
I didn't grow up with that 50s stereotype wife.
No, but you also didn't grow up having to cooperate and share in doing the domestic tasks.
Yeah, no, that's true.
That are necessary in life. Yes. So this was a learning curve for you.
Yeah.
But I don't remember you ever being affronted by the request that you take the time to clean up after yourself or that you cooperate in getting the tasks around the more domestic side of our life done?
It was more subtle than that. It was this internal thing, and it took me a while actually to put my finger on it. It was a really subtle sort of internal resistance. It wasn't even, verbalised in my head, or it wasn't cognitive. It was really quite an emotional thing, but subtle. And that was one of the things that I focused on a lot as I got older, was to pay attention to those inner sort of dynamics of,
Do you think that was because you didn't think they were important enough for you to be bothered with?
No, it was
had more important things to do with your day or your time?
At times there was an element of that, and I still have that to some degree. It's like I don't wash the car. Why? Because if I wash the car, it's going to take me all day because I'm a perfectionist. Whereas if I hand it to the guy at the car wash and pay him $30, I'm out of there in 45 minutes. So it's partly efficiency, partly just self-preservation thing. And I don't check the car out when I leave the car wash, because I'll always find half a dozen things to go, you missed this. But that's my own sort of personality thing, and I've recognised to work with that. Now, some people might think that I'm sort of domestically incompetent, but that's not the case. It's just understanding myself. As Socrates says, know thyself, and that's one of the things I focused on most of my life, is to actually coming to fully understand myself in that. And so I think that's an important aspect to bring to the table as well, because when you and I have had conflict about certain things, it's never been about blame.
No.
Both of us take ownership for each other's. Like, I take ownership for my stuff and you take ownership for your stuff.
Well, that's right, but then neither of us are trying to force the other to fit into some sort of mould that they are not going to be comfortable with and isn't true to who they are. And I think this is one of those issues that a lot of couples have, that they don't step back and reflect on what they're saying to each other and where it's coming from and whether it is truly what they want to say or not. There's a lot of stuff that people do that is in fact unconsciously mirroring the roles that they're in rather than the person that they are.
Yeah, I agree.
The role of wife or the role of husband, as they learnt it to be while they were children in a household. So what they often are doing is mirroring their parents. They're not being authentically who they are. And so, you hear people saying it all the time, that they hear themselves saying something that they heard all through their childhood from their parents. And, it can be something simple that is just one of those throwaway things, like I used to say that I remember very well when the kids would forget to close the screen door, and I would say, out of my mouth would come my father's words, do you think we live in a tent? Close that screen door.
Yeah.
Now, but that's a very everyday sort of thing.
Yeah.
But some people are saying very important, sometimes very inappropriate and unloving things to their partners that actually are not what they think and feel. They are words that they have taken on board all through their childhood that come out of their mouth. And words can harm and they can really, really cause damage. People remember words for very long times.
Absolutely. So let me come back to this thing about developmental stages. So we talked about, we've gotten up to 3 years. The next stage fundamentally is up to 7 years. So 3 to 7.
You are asking a lot of my memory.
No, it's okay. No, because by this stage we were parents.
Yes.
Now, there's often, when I talk to people at the moment, there's and in therapy a lot of stuff comes up about, the conflict between me and then, as you pointed out, the role, right? So what's my role as a mother or father? And you said something in the beginning that I thought was really important, and that is that ultimately, once we have children, the kids are the priority.
Always.
And you and I have never varied on that. And the research